In this teaching, I want to talk about a characteristic that is a non-negotiable. It's indispensable for somebody who is a disciple of Jesus. And I'm going to base it on John chapter 8, very well-known passage, the woman who was brought to Jesus because she was caught in adultery. Now stick with me to the end because I'm going to be very transparent with you, and I'm going to talk to you about a time when I did not demonstrate this characteristic of a disciple. Hey, fellow disciple, welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Mario Escobedo. This channel is for church leaders who are wanting to grow. The whole purpose of this channel is to equip you to grow as a disciple who advances the mission Jesus started. If that's something that interests you, then hey, click that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. That way you're always up to date on the latest teachings. Talking about equipping you to grow as a disciple, I've got a free 4-part workshop that I've titled The Call to Discipleship. I take a look at Matthew chapter 4, verses 18 through 20, when Jesus called his first disciples, and I extract some discipleship principles that I know are going to help you as you continue to grow as a disciple who advances the mission Jesus started. Check it out at my website, marioescobedo.org, completely for free. Also, I am super stoked, really excited to let you know about my podcast that recently launched, and it's called Equipped, the podcast. And you'll find it on all of the major podcast directories and platforms. Check it out, subscribe, and you're going to get more in-depth teaching than what I can provide here on the YouTube channel. In fact, this teaching that I'm doing right now, this video right now, is a condensed version of a longer episode or a longer teaching that I did on the podcast. So be sure to check out the podcast, links in the description. All right, getting into the teaching. I think you're familiar with John chapter 8. This is when the woman who was caught in adultery was brought to Jesus by a group of scribes and Pharisees. And of course, they want justice, right? They want Jesus to just condemn the lady. And we know, because the passage tells us, that they were looking for a way to trap Jesus, a way to use his own words against him. So they bring him this woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. And let's see what happens here. Starting with verse 5, this is what happens. Teacher, this is them talking to Jesus. This woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? Now, the number one question that most people ask is, where's the guy, right? She was caught in adultery. She wasn't by herself. Where's the guy? I'm not going to deal with that in this teaching, but in the podcast, I give some pretty extensive explanation as to what I think could possibly have happened to the guy. So what we see happening here is that the Pharisees are accusing this woman and they're appealing to the law, right? The problem was that the Pharisees had converted the law into something that God never intended it to be. The Pharisees had converted the law into a weapon. They threatened the people of Israel with the law, and that's never what God intended the law to be. And by threatening the people of Israel with the law, what happened is that they actually alienated the people of Israel from God himself. And that was never the purpose. That was never the intent of God giving the people of Israel the law. God, through the law, wanted to bring the people to him. Now, obviously, it was a huge responsibility to live according to the law. There were consequences, there were punishments, but the point of the law, or the point of God giving the people the law, was not to threaten them, was not to alienate them from him, rather to draw them close to him. And unfortunately, and I can't tell you exactly when historically this happened, but the scribes and the Pharisees had converted the law into a weapon, a tool that they used to threaten the people, and that actually ended up alienating the people from God. So they asked Jesus, so what do you say? Like, what should we do? This woman was caught in adultery. This is what the law says we should do. And the right answer for Jesus would have been, you're right. That is what the law says to do. But I want you to notice the genius answer that Jesus gives the Pharisees. And you're aware of this. Is a very well-known verse in the Bible, right? This is what Jesus says in verse 7. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. Now, the reason I say this is genius is because Jesus didn't deny the authority and the power of the law, but at the same time, he didn't do something that was going to condemn the woman. See, again, they were trying to trap Jesus with his own words, so they were probably expecting him to say something like, you know what, no, back off, leave her alone, and then later use that against Jesus. Well, Jesus didn't give them that opportunity, but neither did he say, do exactly what the law says. His answer doesn't deny the law, doesn't negate the law, but at the same time, it doesn't give them permission to do what they want it to do. This is a genius answer. He tells them, hey, if you're without sin, have at it. Be the first one. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus' response, it deals not only with sin, but I would argue it deals more with grace than with the issue of sin. Obviously, of course, each one of those men who were there now accusing this woman, they had sinned. I mean, there's no doubt, there's no question that they had sinned. And the fact that they had sinned, yet they were still there, indicates, to me at least, that they had also been recipients of grace. So what they were not willing to extend to the woman was what they at some point, because they had sinned, had received themselves. So by Jesus saying, if you're without sin, go ahead and cast the first stone, I think the other side of that statement, or a very similar statement from Jesus' part, would be, if you've never been a recipient of God's grace, go ahead and cast the first stone. Well, of course, not a one of them had not ever sinned, and each one of them had been recipients of God's grace. We'll find out that one by one, they start to walk away, starting with the elders. And then Jesus has this conversation, intimate, beautiful conversation with this woman, starting in verse 10. He says, woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? She said, no one, Lord. And Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. So here, I think Jesus demonstrates the heart of the law. I think here Jesus demonstrates the purpose in God giving the people of Israel the law. It's grace. And we never think of the law being grace-filled. But again, the purpose of the law, the giving of the law itself, was an act of grace, because it was through the law that God was teaching the people of Israel how to draw close to him, how to gain favor with him. And as many consequences and punishments as there are in the law, no one is denying that, there's also instructions on how to obtain God's grace, favor, and forgiveness. And so here in this situation, Jesus, I think, is expressing the heart of the law. It's drawing people who have sinned close to God, not trying to alienate them. But listen, I think we struggle sometimes with demonstrating grace, extending grace, because we feel that by doing so, we're ignoring the sin that the person has committed. Like we're turning a blind eye to the sin. We've confused extending grace with turning a blind eye towards sin. That's not at all what it is, because you know what happens next. You know what Jesus said, right? He says, okay, I don't condemn you either. But the last words Jesus told this woman, and from now on, sin no more. So he extends grace, yet he doesn't let her off the hook. He still says, stop sinning. There's grace, but there's also responsibility. You've been given grace. Now respond appropriately to the grace that you've been given. Now, this brings us to this practical, non-negotiable, indispensable characteristic or principle of being a disciple of Jesus. And here it is. Disciples of Jesus extend grace to others even when they don't deserve it. This woman had been caught in the act of adultery. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't argue against it. She didn't deserve grace and forgiveness, yet Jesus did it anyway. And so we, as disciples of Jesus, of course, our goal, our purpose is to imitate Jesus in his attitude, in his behavior, in his behavior towards other people, his interaction with other people. And so if Jesus extended grace to this woman who did not deserve it, had been caught red-handed in the very act of sin, then if we're imitating Jesus, if we are disciples of Jesus, then what that means for us is that we are obligated to do the same that Jesus did. We extend grace. Again, we don't turn a blind eye, we don't condone it, but we extend grace. That's what disciples of Jesus do. Now, I told you that I was going to share an instance of when I didn't express this characteristic. I failed the grace exam. Now, I'm a pastor, and so in one of our services, we were praying for people, and two women approached me. It was a mom and a daughter, but the daughter was already an adult woman. She was a mother herself. But the mom and the daughter, and the mom starts talking to me. And she says, Pastor, I really need you to pray for my daughter. She's going through a very difficult situation right now. And in fact, just last night, her kids were taken away from her for neglect or abuse, whatever the case may have been. Just last night, her kids were taken away from her. So I approach the daughter, the one whose kids have been taken away from her. And she was looking down, so I asked her, hey, look at me. And when she raises her head, her eyes are bloodshot. And she's kind of breathing a little bit hard, a little heavy. And I could smell the alcohol coming out of her mouth, her breath. And it wasn't that she had been drunk the night before. It was that she was drunk right now, like there. And the very first thought that came to my mind was, no wonder. No wonder they took your kids away from you. Now, I didn't say that, but I was definitely thinking it. No wonder they took your kids away from you. I mean, you come to church, a church service, and you're drunk? In that moment, I mean, just put Pharisee, scribe, teacher of the law right here. I was doing the exact same thing to that woman that the Pharisees had done to the woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. I was passing judgment. And probably somewhere in the back of my mind, I was saying, get her, God. Yeah, go ahead, get her, God. She deserves it. And I failed the grace exam. And here I am, a pastor who in just a few minutes later, I was going to get up and preach a sermon, certainly on God's love, forgiveness, grace, etc. And yet in the moment when I had the opportunity to give somebody hope because of God's grace, I failed the grace exam. Now, fortunately, the Holy Spirit at that moment just prompted my heart. Really, he convicted me and he said, what are you doing? Who do you think you are? Haven't you been a recipient of God's grace? What makes you think that she can't be a recipient of God's grace? And it was a moment that really I'll never forget. It was one of those watershed moments in ministry where I said, Lord, may I never, and I still struggle with this. I think we all do. Lord, may I never, never, never disqualify somebody from being a recipient of your grace. This is what Jesus did. He extended grace. Let me put this back up on the screen. He extended grace to others even when they didn't deserve it. And I'll reiterate this, that as disciples of Jesus, we seek to imitate Jesus in attitude, behavior, interaction with others, then we're obligated to extend grace to others as well, even when they don't deserve it. Now, you see how this is a non-negotiable characteristic for a disciple of Jesus. Two reasons that I can think of right off the top of my head of why we need to extend grace to others. Number one, Jesus did it. I've been saying that. If we're disciples of Jesus, then we need to extend grace to others. If for no other reason, well, Jesus did it. He's our master. He's our example. We're his disciples. We do what he did. Secondly, I alluded to this earlier, the Holy Spirit convicting me. We've been recipients of God's grace, and we didn't deserve it. And so our appropriate response to having been recipients of God's grace is to extend grace to others as well. Listen, I mentioned to you, this bears repeating, that this teaching is just a small part of a much more extensive teaching that I did in the podcast, Equipped. It's episode number 2, Equipped to Extend Grace to Others. I'll leave a link in the description. Be sure to check it out because I go into much more detail in this passage, and I do think that you'll get some benefit from it. Okay, hey, fellow disciple. We're fellow disciples. We're both on this journey, on this path to grow as disciples who advance the mission that Jesus started. You have been equipped. Now take what you've learned and equip others. Until the next one, God bless.